All right, so it's 7:05. If anyone joins, I will let them in as they come. So welcome to our 2021 budget meeting with our joint budget meeting that we host every year with Councillor Darouze. My name is Scott Moffatt. I happen to also be a councillor. George, while being much older than me, has not been a councillor as long as me, but that's just the way things work sometimes, and that's okay. We don't make fun of him for being old too much. Most of the time we do, but not too much. I'm recording this so he can use this against me later on. So we're going to run through a presentation. I have Wendy Stephens here as well. She is the Chief Financial Officer with the City of Ottawa, and she's going to run through a presentation on the 2021 draft budgets, and then we'll take questions from those who have joined us. I'll let George say a few words before we go to Wendy, but just quickly too, when we get through the presentation, the one for questions afterwards, you can use, there's a couple functions that on Zoom that you can use in the reactions portion. So you can put your hand up, raise your hand if you want to ask a question, and I can go to you. Now there's only so many of us here, so it's not the end of the world if you just want to chime in too. I'll try to keep everyone to make sure people are muted, so there's no one kind of jumping in throughout the thing. But yep, so we'll be here as long as you are willing to ask questions. Ideally, we're scheduled from 7 till 8, but if we want to go longer than that, I have nowhere else to be because I have zero life. So for that said, I'll go ahead to George Darouze.
Thank you very much, Scott, and I really appreciate your staff and my staff, and of course Wendy Stephens here with us tonight to organizing this public consultation on Zoom. I know that we live in very strange time and COVID forced us to do business different way, but at least we are able to reach out to our community and making sure that we do have a public consultation, even though COVID is in between in our community. So I want to thank you and your staff and my staff and Wendy and your staff for really accepting this invitation to shed some budget 2021 on Osgoode Ward 20 and of course Rideau-Goulbourn. So thank you very much, Scott, for organizing that.
Thank you. I think the only time we couldn't hold a meeting was a snowstorm, but no snowstorms getting in the way of Zoom. Of course, for the rural area, so snowstorms likely do get in the way of people actually connecting to the internet and being able to join us, in which we would just talk to ourselves. So with that said, we will now move on to our aforementioned CFO, Wendy Stephens, and I will start to share her presentation so that you guys can all see it and stop staring at me.
Thanks very much, Councillor. Appreciate the introduction, and good evening, everybody. As you all know, my name is Wendy Stephens. I'm the CFO here at the City of Ottawa, and I have overall responsibility for the team that's pulling together the budget for 2021. And tonight, I'm just going to give you a really brief overview in terms of the city's budget, its composition, the budget process, and ways in which you can provide input on that process. So you can just flip to the next slide, Councillor. So there's an overarching framework that determines how much we need to be collected in taxes for city services. And what we do is we work backwards from that tax target to build up that number. And it's really best to start with that tax target to make sure that our budgets remain affordable. The city has to estimate and determine any increases that we have in expenditures that result from inflation, things like cost of living increases or changes to regulations and legislation that impact our expenses, increased costs in terms of maintaining our assets, and growth just service new neighborhoods and changes in funding from other levels of government. And I think very unique, Councillor Darouze spoke about this in terms of, being in the middle of the COVID pandemic. Very unique for us in 2021 is really looking at those impacts in terms of COVID on our budget and our continued response to that in 2021. And we know that we're going to see increased expenses to provide those services to residents in a very safe and secure manner, as well as decreased revenues because we're going to have a slower return to city services. And then looking at all of those things, we try to offset some of those pressures to find efficiencies in the work and the way we deliver our services or do the things here at the city that we can achieve from our overall operations. We also look at increases in revenues from fees that are charged directly to our users for city services, and taxes from new assessment that help pay for the increased operating and infrastructure costs to service those new neighborhoods. So basically, when you look at the equation at the bottom of the slide, it's expenditures less our revenues is that required taxation. You can flip to the next slide, please. So when we look at 2020 and our total expenditures, the total operating budget was $3.76 billion. And approximately 60% of that operating budget is made up of 4 key services. So our community and social services, our police services, transit, and water and sewer services. And you'll see on the next slide, much of the revenue for these services comes from other sources, so not property taxation. And important to note is water and sewer services is paid for by revenue from the water bill. Half of the transit and operating costs are paid by fare revenue, and approximately 80% of the community and social services are paid by the provincial and federal funding. About 9% of our operating budget goes towards capital cash reserves to help pay for infrastructure renewal and growth. And then we've got a remaining 31% of our budget that covers basically all the other services that we deliver to our residents. You can flip to the next slide. So when you look at our 2020 total revenues, here you can see that just over 50% of our revenues come from taxes and payment in lieu of taxes. And the payment in lieu of taxes is really that payment that comes to the city from the federal properties that are owned here in the city. Another 19% comes from federal and provincial grants, and 25% comes from fees and charges. So things like our water bill and our transit fares and our parks and recreation fees. You can flip to the next slide. So when we break down our budget for capital, the total capital budget for 2020 was about $813 million. And the highest asset intensive area is really water and sewer services, transit, and transportation, which includes our roads. When you look at that bucket of tax-supported services, 66% of that is for the renewal and replacing of our aging infrastructure. And then similarly, on the rate side for water and sewer services, 84% of that bucket is also for renewal of those assets. And the remainder is growth, which is primarily funded by development charges or other regulatory or strategic initiatives. And what's not included here is projects that are of strategic importance. So things that are not approved as part of our budget process, but they may require a separate report and approval from council. So an example of that would be our central library or our light rail. You can flip to the next slide, please. So here you can see about 68% of our capital funding comes from cash reserves put aside from a capital contribution from the operating budget. And the remainder of the capital fund program is funded by debt and funding from other levels of government and development charges. You can flip to the next slide, please. So this slide is really intended to show that there's little discretion to reduce spending for many of the city services. The police budget is tabled separately. Council doesn't have the discretion to make line-by-line changes, and they can only approve or reject that budget in its entirety. Budget reductions in other areas like transit or fire or paramedics and roads have to be accompanied by changes in our service standards. And there's also a long list of services or expenditures where there's little or no discretion because these services are mandated or regulated, such as our long-term care, our public health, our housing, and our debt charges. So there's a little more discretion in the areas that are funded by fees, where the fees can be increased to recover the cost of delivering that services, or in areas where there's no specific service standard or the administrative support services. You can flip to the next slide, please. So in terms of 2021, Council approved the Budget Directions Report for 2021, and they're summarized here on this slide. So the municipal tax target is set at an overall increase of 3%. That includes a citywide levy increase of 2.5%, Ottawa Police Services levy at 3%, and that's mainly driven by the fact that they have their own capital program, so they don't participate like the rest of the city in the capital program. Our transit levy will be increased by 4.6%, and that really has to do with an increase in a $5 million contribution to capital that deals with the cancellation of the provincial gas tax. And then we look at the revenues that we're going to receive from the assessment growth, and our forecast is an increase or a projection of 1.5%. And then you look at our water bill, our overall rate increase from the revenue will be 4.8%, which is aligned with our long-range financial plan. And our user fees and our charges will increase in accordance with our fiscal framework and our LRFP. And then we're also applying any incremental COVID-19 cost recovery to some of those fees as well. And then our capital budget will be developed in accordance with the direction outlined in our 2019 development charges background study, and also in accordance with our long-range financial plan. You can flip to the next slide, please. So this highlights the dates and the steps in the process. Our budget directions, as I said, were approved on October 14th, and public consultations are underway. They're taking place throughout October and November. And our budget, along with the budgets for the various boards and commissions, will be tabled on November the 4th. And basically from that date to December 8th, the individual budgets will be discussed at committee, the boards and the commissions. They're reviewed. And there's an opportunity there for public delegations where the public can provide additional feedback on the budget through a delegation. And then the budget will move to the committee as a whole and council for approval on December the 9th. And this year, as per last, individual committees still have that flexibility to make recommendations to make budget changes that could be funded from reductions in other committee budgets, and they would rise to a committee of the whole for discussion and approval. And final approval of the recommendations will be made on December the 9th, which is our council date. You can flip to the next slide. So this is a list of the budget meetings that are going to take place where public delegations can provide input and recommendations. And this list too can be found on the city's website, and it's updated if there are any changes that are made in the dates. You can flip to the next slide. So there's several resources that are available to you and ways that you can provide input into the budget throughout the year. And they're available on the city's website. Engage Ottawa is a great tool. It provides a comprehensive online engagement platform that really allows you to connect with the city in an interactive manner and provide feedback. You can also provide input and complete our online survey and send an email to budget@ottawa.ca, or feel free to reach out to your ward councillor and provide feedback to them. All your feedback is reviewed and considered, and your participation this evening in this public meeting is greatly appreciated, and very much look forward to answering any questions that you might have. So I'll now pass it back to Councillor Darouze and Councillor Moffatt, and just thank you very much for the time.
Thank you very much, Wendy. I really appreciate the presentation and going through the slides. I know that this is a very challenging time for our budget, and I know that there is a lots of work happening behind the scene to making sure that we be sustainable for 2021. And I know that we're using every resources and we're looking at every envelope to making sure we'll be able to sustain 2021, and making sure also we don't cut services, and making sure that we have, and we're dealing with the challenges coming from the COVID-19 that we are facing right now, which is everyone is in the same boat in every municipality in Ontario. So thank you very much. I appreciate it. And I'll move it to Scott right now.
Thank you very much, Councillor. And thank you, Wendy, for your presentation. So with that, I'm happy to go straight into questions. I don't see any, like I said, there's a raise hand function, and it shows me that you want to ask a question, and then I can come to you. Trust me, you don't want me asking questions all night, because I'm going to ask what I want to ask. It might not be what you want to ask. All right. Grace has a question with her actual hand.
With my actual hand, I know. I can't get used to the other one. I had a couple of questions. One had to do with the efficiencies and whether there was already work underway to achieve some target in that area, given the current financial situation, and whether the change in operations due to COVID makes that easier or harder. And my second question had to do with the user fees where there's a COVID-19 cost recovery effect, and is there a general area that applies to?
I can take that, councillors. With respect to the efficiencies, it's something that we do on a very regular time frame, and it's no different for us this year. But what I would suggest to you is that you know, with the pandemic, we've really had to pivot in terms of how we deliver our services, and we're very much leveraging our online services or different ways in which we can serve our residents. So that's part and parcel in terms of what we're looking at, and also that kind of what I would call lens we're putting on building the budget for this year is where can we find those efficiencies, something that we always do. And I'm going to say some of them probably could be very short term and immediate, whereas there's a longer look out as well in terms of, you know, whether it's looking at the space that we have here at the city and things like that. So there's that piece to it. And then in terms of the COVID fee recovery, it's really just a question of looking at our fees to make sure that we're recovering our costs. So we very much align our fees to the framework that we have built in our fiscal framework, and it's making sure that, you know, we're doing true cost recovery in terms of the services that we offer. So if there's an additional cost with respect to COVID, then we're going to look at incorporating that into the fee where it makes sense. And, you know, there's an affordability aspect of it too. So, you know, maybe we'll be looking to add a little bit to the fee, but then the municipality will also absorb some of that as well.
So there aren't actual areas where that's already been put in place then?
No, it won't be put in place, not currently, but as we move into 2021, it will be part of some of our budget fee schedules.
Okay.
All right, thank you, Grace. Did you have another question at all, or?
I'm sure I do, but somebody else can ask first.
All right, does anyone else have any, just looking for other questions from some of the residents here? I see we have at least, I want to say, I think A. Lowe, I believe, is a resident, C-Jaw, and Doug's iPhone.
Yes.
I knew it was you, Doug.
Yeah. Well, I know you're very disappointed that I can't get the video to work, so you just have to hear my voice. I had a question, I guess, for Wendy. There was some discussion a couple of months ago. I thought it was a city staff person talking about the lost revenue from transit, that some of that might have to be recovered from capital projects, or money that would go to capital projects would be used to offset. Is that a fact? I did hear it. I don't know who said it. So that was my first question.
So in terms of transit, we have received some funding from the Safe Restart Agreement, which is fantastic. So the feds in the province have flowed about $74.9 million to the city to help us with that. There is a report that went to Transit Commission and subsequently Council to deal with the other sort of piece of that. And I, forgive me, I believe it's about 47 million or $49 million. And we will be making an application for phase 2 funds to cover that gap. If we are successful, then we don't have to necessarily dip into the projects that have been deferred. But what we've done is in that report that went, we made a couple of recommendations around how are we going to solve that gap if the money doesn't flow to the city. So there were a series of projects that were deferred. So there's some transit things, and they're largely related to what I call IT initiatives, or customer service initiatives, where they've either haven't started that work, or there's no impact to the services they're going to be providing. So they don't affect the LRT in any way, as an example. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, Doug.
So,
But
so it's possible that there might be some loss of capital funding, but that could be worked out, that there would not be any.
yeah, that's right. So if we receive our full funding allotment through our phase 2 allocation, then we don't necessarily have to dip into that capital.
That's good to hear. My second question, in regard to user fees, is that just for a simple guy from the country, does that mean that there's a possibility that rates for arenas, community centers, etc., would be raised in the 2021 budget?
So there's, when we look at that cost recovery, so I'm just going to say, put it very simplistically, where say that staff member at the arena has to wear a mask, or we have to provide extra hand sanitizer, then you could see a small charge added to that rental as a result of that, just to recover some of those costs.
So the basic rental for renting a hall is not targeted to be increased significantly.
No, they're not significant increases. Just remember, every year our fees increase. I want to say usually by inflation, so it's about 2% or 2.5%. So if anything, we would look to recover some of those incremental costs that we would have, but they're not significant.
One, Scott, if I might, just one final, and then this is my last one. It's a hypothetical. If the ward boundary changes and Osgoode and Cumberland, rural Cumberland are added to Osgoode, how would that affect the budget allocations for rural areas? For Osgoode, for example.
It wouldn't. We don't allocate. I mean, you know this, Doug. We don't allocate money based on ward boundaries at all. It's based on priority or across the rural area. That might mean that West Carleton gets a bit more one year than another, and Rideau-Goulbourn or Cumberland get a bit more another year. Now it's also not based on wards because of the size of the wards. Rideau-Goulbourn is 744 square kilometers. West Carleton is 759 square kilometers. Cumberland ward is 463 square kilometers. I think Osgoode ward is 358 square kilometers. Yeah. Might be wrong on some of those numbers, but you see that if we actually were awarding or allocating budgets based on wards, it wouldn't be proportionate. So we don't do that. The ward boundary, which wouldn't take effect until after the next election, of course, in 2022, would not be impacted whatsoever by capital budgets.
Yeah, I understand it, and I think Councillor Darouze has, and I think rightly stated that, you know, the budget allocations for roads in Osgoode ward is so much, but if the rural wards are doubled, the road size is doubled, that could mean a significant reduction in the money that might go to roads in Osgoode ward.
Only from it. Now you could look at it from a traffic calming. We have ward specific traffic calming budgets. That's something that could be impacted, and who knows, we'll have to look at that. But I mean, at the same time, that's not perfect system either, because right now we have, like I said, we have wards that are half the size of other wards. We have wards that have twice the population of other wards, and we all get the exact same amount of money for traffic calming. You know, Jan Harder represents 60,000 people. I represent 30,000 people. Some wards have more schools than others. Some wards have higher speeding issues than others. Osgoode ward is half the size of Rideau-Goulbourn ward. But right now, it's not.
You have a lot of forested area.
I do.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a lot of forest area that people can drive fast in, right?
No, sorry, I know this is a hypothetical question. It was. Thank you for taking time to address that, and I'll just listen now.
I doubt that. Does anyone? So I see Grace has her hand up for a second question. Just looking at the other residents. Again, I see Alo, Seajaw. There's also Michael Ben Murgy, who I missed earlier. If you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask. If not, I will go back to Grace Thrasher in 3, 2, 1, go, Grace.
You're making me pay attention here. I just have another question about the presentation, and you talked about a percentage that went to repair aging infrastructure, and I missed the actual percentage number. But my question also related to, does that really focus on projects like the replacement of the sewers and water on like Elgin Street? Is that the type of project that would come in that area? Or does it also include like road resurfacing projects that are more common in the rural areas?
So it's definitely a mixture of both. So there's 2 buckets. One is tax supported services, which is supported by the tax dollar, and then the other one is rate supported services, right? So that's if you get a water bill and you're paying for that. So what I had quoted was 66% of the capital budget for tax supported services was for the renewal of replacement. And for water and sewer, that renewal percentage is approximately 84% of that bucket.
Really high.
Yeah, you have to remember, gosh, I'm going to go back probably till time before I was actually born, you know, around when the region was here. And a lot of that infrastructure, as I understand, you know, was put in place back then. So it's aging significantly.
Okay. That's it. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Grace. Yeah, I mean, obviously, I'd love to hear from anyone else if they had any questions. You know, by all means, you can. Yeah, I don't need to see you. You don't need to put your camera on if you're not comfortable with that. But feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question if you'd like. You know, this is eventually there will be more opportunities to speak to this. You have multiple. Wendy put up the list of committees that this goes to. I believe I sit on half of those committees. So if you want to come speak to me, you know, the old Dale Harley thing, and come speak to me about 16 times during the budget process, you're more than welcome to do that. Doug knows all about Dale Harley. So it's, yeah, there'll be good opportunities for that. So the budget gets tabled on, remind me, November 6th? 4th. It was November 6th, maybe last year. So November 4th, and then it'll come to council in the middle of December. And so plenty of time between now and then to provide comment, feedback on what you see. Of course, I know we'll do our best, George and I, to communicate with the community as to what's in the budget when it gets tabled on the 4th. We'll put that out there to the community so that people know what to expect, and any feedback that you have. You know, certainly we know that it won't be a typical budget. We know that we've not been dealing with a typical year so far this year. Thankfully, you know, over the last 10 years, the city's built up a healthy reserve. We are in a good financial position. I know Wendy mentioned that at a previous council meeting with an update on that situation. I think maybe it was at FedCo or if it was at council, but we are doing well. I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think we went from $150 million in reserves to upwards of above $300 million in reserves in our various reserve accounts. So, which is important. I mean, any good corporation is supposed to be in that sort of a 10% of their total budget range of being available for reserves. So we are in a good position that way, but it doesn't mean that we want to go and raid those reserves to be able to stay, you know, status quo and keep doing things as we've been doing them, because that would be somewhat irresponsible as well. So if there are no further questions, I was just talking for the sake of talking to see if somebody would come up with a question.
Scott, it's Doug Thompson.
Doug, I didn't know we were going to hear from you again.
I just wondered if we could get, it's not a question, just a copy of Wendy's presentation. How can we obtain that?
Well, I have it on my computer.
Or George maybe could send it, or either one. Yeah,
I could send it to you. Okay. I'm less likely to be blocked on your email address account, so I can send it.
You owe me a couple, Scott.
No, I'll email it to you. Just I have your email address, so yeah, I'll email it to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
No problem. You'll have it after the meeting. I will end the Zoom meeting and email you.
Okay.
It'll be my biggest priority right now.
I'll miss the football game. Just waiting.
Is it a football game during COVID? No, I'm just joking. Is it full of fans? Full of Trump fans? getting COVID and keeping our border closed forever because America can't get their shit together. Oh, I'm recording this.
It's one of the fan-free games.
Oh, it's one of the things. So it's
Yeah.
in one of those smart cities.
It's in Buffalo.
Oh, good old Buffalo.
Seriously.
I'm sure they're still outside the stands jumping off of buses through tables, though.
They're not showing them. If you're not, I still have another question. If nobody
by all
else
means.
is going to.
Go, Grace.
Sorry, now it's gone out of my head. It'll come back. Oh, yes. Delays in infrastructure projects. Is there an expectation that some of the projects that might have been in the hopper for the next year might get pushed further off into the future because of the tight financial situation that the city faces?
I don't know, maybe Wendy wants to add. I know at this point, I think there has been about 33 projects citywide, and I know that, you know, for myself, I believe it was only one project that was in Rideau-Goulbourn. That was a play structure renewal project in Healy's Heath up near Stittsville. I believe in Stittsville Ward 2, and speaking and understanding Glenn's ward, there was a similar project deferred. The intent is to try to do those projects in 2021. I don't think at this point, if we know if there'll be further delays or things that need to be pushed off, but maybe Wendy has more to add to that.
Yeah, I think it really relates to whether we're going to see additional government funding. And that's one of the assumptions that we built in to our budget. So when we presented our budget directions for 2021, we've assumed that the government's going to be there to help us with some of these incremental costs. What we have done to safeguard the city's position is we have mitigations that are sitting in the background. So if we need to leverage those, we can leverage those to fill our gap. My hope is that no, we won't have to defer any more capital projects. That would, it's best for our city, it's best for our economic recovery in so many ways. So I think it's just dependent in terms of whether other levels of government come to help us or not.
Thanks.
All right, thank you.
That's it, I promise.
Well, it will be, because I'm just going to end the meeting next time you try it. No, I'm just joking. I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't do that, Grace. I never do that to you. George, do you want to add anything? Do you want to wrap up?
And I just want to thank everyone who joined us tonight. I know it's been difficult through COVID, but I mean, we have the tools in our toolbox and we'll be using everything we can. I want to thank Wendy for joining us. And I want to thank you, of course, that as usual, you and I have been doing this since for 6 years now. We've been doing it together. So it's been always successful. I have a quick, just for the background. Wendy, can you just for the community leader that they join us, like, can you talk a little bit about the deficit and where we at so far with, I know that from a perspective of municipality, we can go into a deficit at the end of the year. Can just maybe just highlight this a little bit for the benefit of our community leaders?
Yeah, sure. So I talked a little bit about the reports that went to council. So our overall deficit position has, it's actually shrunk. So it's better than we had projected. It was originally 192 million. It's sitting around 181 million. The largest piece of that really has to do with our transit revenues and the reduction in ridership. And then we've got our tax supported piece that deals with really all of those incremental costs that we're dealing with COVID. So, having that PPE, extra staff to be able to deliver those services in our long-term care, public health. And so what the senior levels of government have done is they introduced the restart agreement. And as I had said earlier, we've got a commitment from those levels of government that we're going to receive for the transit piece, 74.9 million, and for the tax supported piece, approximately $49.3 million. So we've got a shortfall left to deal with. We have an opportunity to apply for additional funds under Phase 2 into the second bucket. We're in the process of doing that now. We have until October 30th to get our application in. Our hope is that we will be made whole as a result of that, which brings us to a great spot as we begin 2021. And if that happens, we, again, as I said, for 2021, we have additional costs associated with delivering those services, some impacts from COVID that are built in. You'll see that when we table our budget. we've assumed the other levels of government are going to be there to help us. If they're not, we've got those mitigations in the background. So we've planned for it. We're not budgeting for a deficit. We have the tools and the mechanisms to be able to pay for it.
Thank you, Wendy. And this is just a little bit to sum it, to make sure that I know that people hear about deficit and going into our fiscal year with deficit. So I'm happy that to clear it a little bit to the community. And I want to thank you very much for explaining that. And I know that Scott and I, we've been working also with the mayor's office and all at FEDCO to making sure that we secure all these dollars from the level of government to making sure that the city of Ottawa is well taken care of. So thank you very much. And thank you, Scott, for being here. And thank you for the community leader that they joined us tonight.
Thank you, George. Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, everyone. Obviously, questions from Grace and Doug, two of my favorite people on either side of the river. So thanks for coming out, and appreciate everyone else for joining us. If you have any questions, you can email myself, scott.moffatt@ottawa.ca. You can contact george.darouze@ottawa.ca as well. And we'd be happy to respond to any questions or any comments you have, feedback on the budget. And this has been recorded, so we'll be able to post this too in case anyone wishes to watch it again in the future and just see some of the scintillating dialogue that occurs between myself and Councillor Darouze on a regular basis, but now captured live on video. So thank you all, and have a good night.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, Grace. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thanks very much. Bye-bye.